Undersecretary Vel Trask had reviewed exactly 1,411 labor contracts in his 19 years administering the Meridian Exchange. And not one of them, not a single one across every species trading through the station, had ever contained the phrase Dock Supervisor Marcus Delgado, used so casually, in passing, over a comm channel that Vel would later replay 11 times trying to determine whether he had somehow misheard it. "Yeah, don't worry about the deadline," Marcus said, wrench still in hand, half his attention clearly on the reactor coupling in front of him. "We'll just pull some overtime, get it done tonight." Vel Trask set down his tablet very carefully, the way a person sets down something they suspect might be about to explode, and turned to his junior administrator with an expression that Naira Ost, having worked beside him for 6 years, had only ever seen him wear twice before, both times during station-wide emergencies that had, in fact, nearly killed everyone aboard. "Did he," Vel said slowly, "just volunteer to work past his contracted shift boundary?" "That's what it sounded like, sir." "Voluntarily?" "It appears so, sir." Vel Trask had built his entire career, his entire understanding of civilized labor practice, around one immovable Kelvix principle, hardwired so deeply into his species' law and biology, both, that most Kelvix had never once had reason to question it. A Kelvix body simply could not function past its contracted shift limit. It was not a rule enforced by supervisors or unions or government inspectors, though the exchange certainly employed all three in overlapping, redundant abundance. It was a biological failsafe, evolved over millions of years on a homeworld where Kelvix ancestors who pushed past safe exertion thresholds simply dropped where they stood, hearts overtaxed, minds fogging past any useful function, and the species that survived long enough to build starships had survived specifically because their bodies refused, absolutely and non-negotiably, to let them work themselves to death. 12 hours precisely, and a Kelvix physiology began shutting down non-essential systems with the calm, patient inevitability of a machine reaching the end of its programmed cycle. It was not weakness. It was, Vel had been taught since childhood, the wisest possible design a species could evolve, a built-in guarantee that no worker, however dedicated, could ever be pressured or tempted into destroying themselves for the sake of a deadline. He had never, not once in 19 years, heard anyone volunteer for the human equivalent of exactly that outcome, with what appeared to be genuine cheerfulness. "Get me his file," Vel said. "I want to understand what we are dealing with before this becomes a station-wide incident." The file, when it arrived, told Vel almost nothing useful, which he found, if anything, more alarming than if it had contained something alarming outright. Marcus Delgado, 41 years old, senior dock supervisor, 6 years of service aboard the exchange, disciplinary record clean, performance reviews uniformly excellent. One small handwritten note from his previous human supervisor that read, in its entirety, "Guy just doesn't know how to leave a job half-finished," which struck Vel as somehow both the least informative and most ominous sentence he had ever read in a personnel file. "I am going to speak with him directly," Vel announced, with the particular grim resolve of an administrator who has decided a threat can no longer be managed from the safety of a report. "Naira, you will accompany me. Bring the incident log. I suspect we may need it." They found Marcus Delgado exactly where his shift log said he would be, 3 hours past his contracted end time, elbow-deep in a coupling housing that had apparently developed a fault serious enough to threaten the exchange's secondary cargo bay's entire ventilation cycling system, whistling something tuneless and entirely unbothered as he worked. "Supervisor Delgado," Vel began, in the careful, formal tone he reserved for potential safety violations, "I am obligated to inform you that our records indicate you are currently 3 hours and 11 minutes beyond your contracted shift boundary. I must ask, directly and for the record, whether you are experiencing any form of duress. Are you being coerced into this labor? Threatened? Is there a supervisor or manager applying pressure you feel unable to refuse? Marcus looked up from the coupling, wiped one hand on a rag, and blinked at Vel with an expression of genuine, mild confusion. Coerced? No, Undersecretary, nobody's making me do this. I just want to get it fixed before Delta Shift comes on is all. Coupling's finicky. If I hand it off half torn apart, somebody's gonna have to spend an hour just figuring out where I left off. Easier if I just finish it myself. But your contract specifies an 8-hour shift boundary, Vel pressed, and heard, even as he said it, how strange the sentence sounded aloud, explaining a basic labor protection to a man who seemed to regard it less as a safeguard and more as a mild suggestion he was choosing, cheerfully, to ignore. You are entitled to stop. The station's safety protocols exist specifically to prevent exactly this kind of extended exertion. Sure, I'm entitled to stop, Marcus agreed easily. I just don't really want to tonight. Look, Undersecretary, I get that's probably a weird thing to hear, given how your folks work. But for humans, it's not really about being forced into it. Sometimes you just look at a job and you go, yeah, I could leave this for tomorrow, or I could just push through another couple hours and wake up tomorrow with it already done. Second option just feels better most days. Not always. But often enough that overtime's kind of just a normal thing we do when it matters enough. Vel Trask stood very still for a long moment, processing this, and Naira asked, watching her superior's expression cycle through several stages of what she could only describe as profound existential unease, found herself, for reasons she couldn't entirely articulate, becoming quietly, deeply fascinated by the entire concept. I would like to understand this properly, Vel said finally, in the tone of a man who has decided a threat requires study rather than immediate escalation. Is there a limit? A point at which even a human body refuses to continue, regardless of willingness. Oh sure, there's a limit, Marcus said. We're not machines. You push past a certain point, judgment starts going, hands get shaky, you start making the kind of mistakes that are way more dangerous than just going home tired would have been. Good supervisors know how to spot it before it gets there. But the limit's not fixed, exactly, not like a hard shutoff. It moves around depending on how much the thing you're working on actually matters to you. I've pulled 16-hour shifts on jobs I didn't care about and felt like garbage by hour 10. I've pulled 20-hour shifts on jobs that mattered and felt basically fine the whole way through, right up until I finished, and then I just about fell over. It's not really a switch. It's more like a tank that fills back up faster when the reason's good enough. That sounds, Vel said slowly, extraordinarily difficult to regulate, extraordinarily difficult to protect against abuse. It can be, Marcus admitted, and for the first time something more serious crossed his easy expression. Won't pretend humans have always gotten that balance right, historically. Whole ugly chunks of our labor history are basically just people figuring out, the hard way, that willingness to push past your limits gets exploited real fast if nobody's watching out for it. That's why we've got labor protections at all, same as you. Difference is, our protections aren't built into the body. They're built into the rules around it. Contracts, unions, supervisors who actually give a damn, folks watching each other's backs so nobody pushes further than they should. It's messier than your system, Undersecretary. I'll give you that. Your way, nobody can be talked into hurting themselves because the body just physically won't let it happen. Ours, the body'll let you go a long way past sensible if the will's there, good reason or bad. Means we gotta be a lot more careful about who we trust to draw that line for us. But it also means, when the reason's genuinely good, we can do things your folks just can't, structurally, no matter how much you might want to. Vel Trask returned to his office that evening in a state Naira had never before witnessed in 6 years of service beside him. Quiet and thoughtful in a way that suggested he was turning something over that did not fit neatly into any of the frameworks his long career had built for him. And it was 3 weeks later, during what began as a routine reactor coolant inspection, that Vel discovered exactly how far that willingness could actually reach. The fault was small at first. A hairline stress fracture in a coolant regulator buried deep in the exchange's aging primary reactor housing, the kind of flaw that should have been caught during a scheduled maintenance cycle months earlier. And through a chain of small administrative oversights that Vel would spend considerable time afterward trying very hard not to blame entirely on himself, had not been. By the time it was discovered, the fracture had already begun to spread, and the station's own engineering projections gave the regulator somewhere between 14 and 18 hours before catastrophic failure, an outcome that would take the exchange's entire primary reactor offline in the middle of a cargo season that currently had 400,000 tons of perishable goods and 11,000 residents depending on continuous power. The repair itself was not, by any engineering measure, simple. It required a full shutdown and manual reseal of a coolant loop that ran through some of the most physically demanding, awkwardly positioned access corridors in the entire station. A job that Kelvik's engineering estimated, under normal shift rotation, would take 4 separate 12-hour crews working in careful, exhausted sequence roughly 31 hours to complete safely. Cutting it uncomfortably close against an 18-hour failure window that nobody could guarantee wouldn't collapse to 12 or 10 if the fracture spread faster than projected. "We cannot make the window," Naira told Vel, staring at the projections with the particular flat despair of an engineer watching numbers refuse to cooperate no matter how many times she recalculated them. "Even at maximum legal crew rotation, we are 4 hours short, minimum, and that assumes the fracture holds exactly at current projections, which reactor stress rarely does. I do not know what to tell the Assembly, Undersecretary. I do not think there is a version of this repair, run entirely within Kelvik's shift law, that finishes before that regulator fails." Vel Trask stood in front of the projection display for a long moment, and Naira watched something settle over his face that she would later describe to her own family, in a letter home that eventually became something of a minor legend among her own relatives, as the exact moment she watched a man decide to bet an entire station's safety on a species he had, 3 weeks earlier, genuinely suspected of being either reckless or insane. "Get me Supervisor Delgado," Vel said, "and I want every available human maintenance crew on this station assembled in the primary access bay within the hour. Naira, I am going to ask you to trust me on something that violates every safety protocol I have spent 19 years enforcing, and I need you to understand that I am asking anyway because I have run out of protocols that actually solve this problem." Marcus Delgado arrived at the access bay 11 minutes later, took one look at the projection display, and did not hesitate for even a moment before turning to the 23 human crew members already gathering behind him. "All right," he said, already pulling on his gear. "Regulators cracking. We've got maybe 18 hours before it takes the reactor with it, and Kelvik's crew rotation can't make that window running standard shifts. Anybody got somewhere they absolutely have to be in the next 18 hours. Nobody moved. "Didn't think so," Marcus said and grinned, the particular tired, determined grin of a man who has done this kind of thing before and knows exactly what it's going to cost, and has already decided privately that the cost is worth paying. "All right, we're pulling a straight run at this, full crew, no rotation off unless somebody's actually about to drop. Rodriguez, you're on regulator seal with me. Chen, get the secondary team staged at each access junction. I want relief water and food running constant. Nobody's stopping to eat proper. We just keep hands moving and mouths fed at the same time. Undersecretary, your engineers know this system better than we do. I want Naira's team feeding us real-time stress readings every 15 minutes, because if that fracture starts moving faster than projected, I need to know before it becomes a decision we don't get to make anymore." "Everybody clear?" 23 human voices answered clear at more or less the same instant, and Vel Trask, standing at the edge of a bay full of people who had, without a single moment of hesitation, volunteered to spend the better part of a full day, and night pushing their own bodies well past every limit his own species' biology would have simply refused to allow. Understood, watching it happen, that he was witnessing something his entire career had never once given him a framework to properly categorize. It took 19 hours and 40 minutes, not 18. The fracture, as reactor stress so often did, refused to cooperate neatly with anyone's projections, accelerating twice during the repair in ways that sent Naira's stress readings spiking hard enough that Vel genuinely believed twice that he was about to watch the entire crew's effort become irrelevant regardless of how hard they pushed. Marcus Delgado worked all 19 hours and 40 minutes without once leaving the access corridor, hands shaking badly by hour 14, voice going hoarse by hour 16, and when Rodriguez finally called the seal complete, Marcus sat down hard against the corridor wall and simply stayed there for several minutes, not quite unconscious but clearly, entirely spent, while the rest of the crew, similarly wrecked, similarly refusing to fully collapse until the job was actually finished, slowly made their way back out into the main bay to the sound of every Kelvix administrator on duty applauding in a manner Naira would later admit was wildly outside normal Kelvix professional decorum. Vel Trask found Marcus still sitting against that corridor wall 20 minutes later, having personally confirmed the regulator seal was holding steady before he allowed himself to go looking, and crouched down beside him with an expression that Naira, watching from a respectful distance, would later describe as the closest she had ever seen her superior come to something like awe. "You could have died," Vel said quietly. "Any one of you. Your bodies had no failsafe to stop you if the exertion became genuinely dangerous rather than merely difficult. You knew that going in, and you did it anyway, for a station that is not even fully your own." "Yeah," Marcus said, voice rough, eyes closed, head resting back against the corridor wall. "That's kind of the whole deal, Undersecretary. We knew going in. Wasn't like we didn't understand what we were risking." He was quiet a moment, catching his breath properly for what looked like the first time in hours. 11,000 people live on this station. Kelvix human, everybody else who's ever come through here. 400,000 tons of cargo that a lot of folks back home are counting on. That's a pretty big reason when you stack it all up. Big enough reason usually gets a human crew a long way further than we'd go for a smaller one. That's the whole secret, really. Overtime's not really about the extra hours. It's about how big the reason has to be before people start volunteering for it without anybody having to ask twice. Vel Trask sat with that for a long moment, and then, in a gesture that would become, over the following months, something of a small legend among Meridian Exchange's administrative corps, formally submitted a proposal to the Kelvix Central Labor Authority recommending an entirely new emergency classification within Kelvix contract law, one that had never previously existed in the species' long, careful, exhaustively regulated history of labor protection. The authority approved it 11 weeks later, somewhat to Vel's own surprise, under the formal designation Emergency Extended Effort Protocol, though within a year, across every Kelvix-administered station in the sector, everyone from senior administrators to junior dockhands had simply started calling it, with a mixture of respect and residual bewilderment that Vel suspected would never fully fade, by the human word it had actually been built to describe. Overtime, filed formally forever in Kelvix labor law as the single most terrifying and most deeply admired concept the species had ever imported from another world, right alongside a quiet, permanent note in the Exchange's own historical archive, credited to Undersecretary Vel Trask himself, that read simply, "Humans cannot be legislated out of caring too much. Plan accordingly."